time to talk about all the things that go into vote by mail. So I will let Weston take it away. Everyone, this is Weston Miller. He is with Civic Nebraska. And if you have any questions for us as we go along, please put them in the chat below and let's get it started.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all so much for having me today. I love it. You get a chance to talk with the league and talk about vote by mail. I feel like I know about half of this group and I don't know the other half. So I'm Weston. I'm the Director of Public Policy with Civic Nebraska. Civic Nebraska is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization like the league. Our mission is that we're committed to creating a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. So that takes a couple different forms for us, but most relevant today is the voting rights team. We work with primarily the state legislature, but any lawmaker when it comes to elections and voting rights policy. My job is to work with lawmakers to make our elections as fair and safe and accessible as possible, which usually means supporting reasonable improvements to our system. But sometimes, as you all know, it means opposing laws that would make it harder for folks to vote unnecessarily. Today, I'm very excited to talk about the more proactive side of things when it comes to vote by mail. So I guess some quick context on why we're even involved in this vote by mail conversation, because Civic Nebraska has not always been, and I think as you all know, this has become a much more urgent conversation recently, the vote by mail conversation. So Civic Nebraska has been supporting the expansion and improvement of vote by mail since 2018. That's when I was able to kind of take over our policy portfolio. And essentially, as I was trying to figure out, or as a team, we were trying to figure out Civic Nebraska's policy priorities. We were doing a survey of essentially just election laws across the country. And we kept coming across some states like Colorado and Utah and North Dakota and Oregon, and states that had really large vote by mail programs, some like Colorado that are entirely vote by mail, and some like Utah at the time and North Dakota that were largely but not entirely vote by mail. And in all of those states, we kept noticing a couple really important similarities. We noticed that turnout was incredibly high as they expanded their vote by mail system. We noticed that the election administration was improved, by which I mean their cost per voter kept going down the more they expanded vote by mail. And maybe most importantly, we noticed that the voter experience was just incredibly strong. Voters in those states had a really positive opinion of the voting process and the election process. And so obviously, as someone who works in Nebraska, a state in which our governor and many elected officials have encouraged us to run the state like you run a business, for me, that means starting with customer service. And so when I saw this election system that was just a positive, voter-focused or customer-focused, if you will, model that increased turnout and was cheaper per voter, I thought, why in the world are we not talking about this? Why are we not working on this? So since 2018, Civic Nebraska has been involved in the vote by mail conversation. Jump ahead a year and a half, and as all of you know, this is now a top of mind conversation for everyone because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And quickly, vote by mail became the most reasonable and safest way to vote. This obviously tremendously changed the conversation and the landscape for elections in Nebraska, particularly for vote by mail. Historically, about 25% of Nebraskans would vote by mail consistently. And then suddenly in the May primary, that number more than tripled. So we are seriously having this conversation. We've seen a serious, rapid scale of our vote by mail system. And it's been really educational. It's been really successful. We've also learned a couple of things we could do to improve. So I hope I can touch on all of those in the next 20 or 30 minutes. Now, obviously, I'm here with the league, and you all are the experts when it comes to registration and turnout. So I'll just give a quick overview in case folks don't know who are watching this, a quick overview of the actual system of vote by mail in Nebraska and how it works. Then I'll do a little kind of frequently asked questions, or I guess myth busting really, about voting by mail. And then we'll end with a couple suggestions for how we can continue to improve our vote by mail system moving forward. So first, as far as voting by mail, a quick note on terminology. I try to bring this up as often as I can. Recently, there have been a lot of terms that are being thrown around. We've got early voting, absentee voting, voting by mail, voting at home. And a lot of these terms are being used interchangeably. Sometimes they're being used to try to create some kind of a difference. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that all of those terms pretty much mean the same thing for all practical purposes. Absentee voting is early voting. Early voting is a form of absentee voting. You can early vote by mail or you can early vote in person. There's a number of different things, but essentially they mean the same thing. Nebraska, thankfully, is a no excuse early voting state, which means that anybody can vote before election day for any reason. You don't have to justify it. And you can do that in person at the election commissioner or county clerk's office, or you can do it by mail. The only two terms that are, I think, meaningfully different are if you hear someone talk about all vote by mail or universal vote by mail. Those two terms do mean something different. That means that in a county or a state or a country that is universally by mail, that means every registered voter is mailed a ballot, which they can then return one of three ways. They can return it by mail, they can return it in a secure drop box, or they can return it in person at the county clerk or election commissioner's office. Nebraska is in kind of a cool situation where as a state, we are not all vote by mail. We are just a no excuse early voting state. We do have a number of counties though who conduct their elections with an all mail or universal by mail system. Last I checked, we have 11 counties who are fully all vote by mail. And again, that means every registered voter is mailed a ballot. They can return it a couple of different ways. We also have another, I think, 7 counties that are partially all vote by mail. So the rules are actually established by precinct. So we have some counties where some precincts are all vote by mail, but others are not. So that's our note on terminology. Feel free to ask later if that is unclear. There's a lot of these words get thrown around interchangeably. A couple other notes on the process in the state. Again, if you want to vote early in Nebraska, unless you live in one of those 11 counties, and if you do, you know, Douglas County is not one of them. If you want to vote early, you've got to request a ballot. Because of in the state have mailed a early ballot request form to every registered voter, which was a great move. That is not usually the case. So that's a quick note I wanted to make is that we think that was great, but we can't guarantee that's going to happen in future elections. That was something that the counties in the state did specifically to account for the impact of COVID. So normally you'd have to request your ballot. You can do that by going to the Douglas County Election Commissioner's website. They have a form which you can print out, you can sign it. The Douglas County Commissioner is very flexible on how to receive that. That's a big reason why the term vote at home has come about rather than the term vote by mail. We realized that it was becoming really confusing, that we were accidentally implying that you have to, put a stamp on it and mail it back. You sure can, but you don't have to. And then again, just a reminder that the automatic mailing of the request forms was a COVID specific provision. That's not something that normally happens. So that's our quick overview of the system. Again, if I've missed something, feel free to ask at the end. I just want to touch on a couple questions that every time I talk about vote by mail, I'm always asked the same 3 or 4 questions. So I wanted to kind of preemptively talk about that, and then we'll talk about some policy recommendations moving forward. Especially given, I'll call it the national rhetoric surrounding vote by mail in elections recently. The first question is always about security. Is voting by mail safe? Is it reliable? Obviously, the league is one of our most reliable partners when it comes to combating the myth of voter fraud in Nebraska when it comes to in-person voting. Civic Nebraska and the league have partnered for many years to stop voter ID laws on that same basis, based on the argument that this myth of voter fraud is really just that. It's kind of a ghost we talk about, but doesn't have any actual evidence for it. I wanted to address this head on because kind of the vote, I guess the voter fraud proponents, the folks who kind of spread that rhetoric about there being this issue of voter fraud. If you'll notice over the last even just 2 or 3 years, they've kind of changed our tactics a bit. Originally it was, there's massive voter fraud, we've got to pass these laws to fix it. And we said, prove it, and they couldn't. So then the tactic changed to, well, there could be this fraud that maybe we don't know about and we've got to stop it. And that hasn't generated the momentum that they're hoping for. So now with vote by mail, we kind of have this new area where you can say, look, here's a new process that is different and therefore scary. And I think there could be a lot of fraud there too. So I want to address the issue of vote by mail fraud. And first, I think that there's something we have to acknowledge, which is that there is documented evidence of campaigns trying to cheat using vote by mail. That is a fact. That is not voter fraud. That's what we call election fraud, which is a very important distinction. Voter fraud is when you, the voter, try to cheat. That's the kind of fraud that is just virtually non-existent. Election fraud, and I think the most obvious example is in 2018, the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina, there was documented proof that one of the campaigns hired a guy who then impersonated, I think, a political party in order to collect ballots that were in areas primarily voting for his opponent, and they threw them in the trash. That happened. The two things we have to acknowledge is, one, that happened, and two, he got caught. All of these systems we have in place for voting have safeguards, and those safeguards work. So yes, in North Carolina, there was a campaign that tried to cheat. They got caught, and that fraud did not impact the result of that election. The results were nullified, and they ran it again. When it comes to voter fraud, that's what I really want to talk about, because that's the myth that is, I think, unfairly promoted all over the country. There are two kinds of voter fraud that people try to talk about. One is double voting. So that would be me trying to vote more than once. And then there's voter impersonation fraud. And that's me trying to pretend to be someone else and voting on their behalf. Voting by mail has two really important safeguards, one of which prevents each of those kinds of fraud. When it comes to double voting, every vote by mail ballot, or the envelope specifically, has a unique barcode that is tied to each registered voter and their address. So there's a barcode on my ballot that arrived. Well, it's returned now, but it had a barcode on it, and that barcode was tied to Weston Miller, who lives at XYZ, Omaha, Nebraska, 68112. If any other voter or any other name, any other address tried to vote on the ballot that had that barcode, it would be flagged and it would be rejected. Conversely, if the county receives a ballot from Weston Miller at XYZ that is not attached to that particular barcode, that ballot would also be rejected. It is impossible for someone in Nebraska to successfully vote twice. I mean, there are countless examples historically where people will do it out of mistake. Like, I voted by mail and I forgot and I tried to vote in person or something like that. And the system easily flags it. One of the votes is counted. If there's anything malicious at play, the county investigates and stops it. So it's truly impossible to successfully vote twice in Nebraska. With that in mind, that leaves us with only voter impersonation fraud. And this is the myth that gets perpetuated, I think, more actively. Voter impersonation fraud is virtually impossible to pull off by mail in Nebraska. And that's primarily due to our signature matching security measures. So if I were to, I don't know, let's find the most malicious version. If I were to wait outside Linda's house and I was going to steal her ballot, I would have to, number one, know when her ballot was arriving. I'd have to steal it and hope she didn't notice. I'd have to steam open the envelope. I'd have to forge her signature. I'd have to steam it shut and mail it back. That signature is going to be checked by election officials who are trained to match signatures, and they're going to notice. Also, if Linda, I don't know, notices her ballot doesn't arrive, she's going to make a phone call, and they're going to say, well, Linda, we've got a ballot for you here, and that's going to cause a problem. So our voting by mail system is incredibly secure. We have unique barcodes to stop double voting. We have signature matching, and frankly, common sense to stop voter impersonation fraud. We also have laws and strict penalties that discourage people. Voter fraud is a felony. Don't do it. And everyone knows that. And they know that one vote is not worth going to prison or a fine of, I think, $10,000. So not a good idea, but also not a concern. We've got great safeguards in place and they work. The final note about reliability is that we also have the ability to track our ballot in Nebraska. And I'll put kind of an asterisk here to say that this is a system that can be improved, but we'll touch on that at the end when it comes to policy recommendations. But we do have a system. If you just go to the Douglas County Election Commissioner's website and you click on, I've got it pulled up here, click on the early voting button, And there's going to be 3 little options right on that first page. And one of them says early voting ballot status check. You have to enter, I think, your name and your address, maybe a little bit more information, and it will help you track the status of your ballot to confirm when they've received it and when it's been counted. So we'll come back to ballot tracking at the end, but we do have a way to keep track of your ballot. A quick note about the post office. This has become surprisingly dramatic in the last couple of months too. There's been a lot of talk in the national news about the post office and can they handle the vote by mail election. All I can tell you is that our local post office officials are absolutely not worried about their ability to deliver election mail in November. There have been a couple articles about it. I forget on which channels, but I remember seeing one quote from a local election official who said, we are more than prepared to handle the Christmas spike in mail, and the election is nothing compared to Christmas. So we're going to be fine. Also, it's just true that election mail is a priority. The USPS will do whatever it takes to get the election mail delivered in time. And also just because I think they're getting unfair press lately, it's important to remember that the latest data I can find shows that in general, the USPS delivers single parcel mail with a 98.8% accuracy rate. They are incredibly good at their jobs. I'm a big supporter of the USPS, and they are equipped to run this election very well. But again, if that makes you nervous, totally fine. Take your ballot, return it in person to the election commissioner's office, or put it in a drop box. That's something that's totally available to you. Then 2 more questions that we often get about just voting itself. And this first one is true for in-person or vote by mail. Can I leave things blank on my ballot, or do I have to fill out the entire thing? You can fill out as much or as little of your ballot as you want. The majority of voters, I shouldn't say the majority, thousands of voters in every state only vote for president. I sure wish they'd vote for more, but that is totally an option available to you. As long as you don't vote for too many candidates on the same race, you're going to be just fine. But if you don't know what, if you don't know what the MUD is and you don't know who the candidates are, I would encourage you to check out resources like the League of Women Voters Voter Guide and figure out more information about those candidates. But if you haven't, you don't have to fill that out if you don't want to. Your ballot will still be counted. Another common question becoming more frequent is if I request a vote by mail ballot, but I decide, let's say, I feel better about COVID, or I just get nervous and I want to go vote on election day, that's fine. As long as you have not returned your vote by mail ballot, you are allowed to vote in person on election day. And you've got 2 choices. The first of which is that you can bring that ballot with you and surrender it at the election commissioner's office, not at the polling place, but at your election commissioner's office before election day. You can just say, I changed my mind, I'm going to vote in person, no problem. If you just show up at the polls, you can vote a provisional ballot. Don't bring your mail-in ballot with you because they can't take it. You can vote a provisional ballot, and that ballot will be counted once they've confirmed that your mail-in ballot was not received. So if you decide you just want to, participate in the day itself, that's totally fine. Just make sure you don't return your mail-in ballot beforehand, or you might get a phone call from the election commissioner. Okay, so we've talked about the system. We've talked about some frequently asked questions. And again, I'm very excited to answer more questions at the end. But I do want to end with a couple policy recommendations as we move forward with voting by mail. And I want to start with, and this is cheesy, but I think it's just true, it needs to be said, that we are incredibly lucky in Nebraska to have a Secretary of State's office and election commissioners and county clerks who are, first of all, very good at their jobs, and second of all, who just genuinely care about running really, really good elections. We have seen in a couple of states throughout the country where I'm not sure that's true everywhere. And we are just very lucky in Nebraska to have the team of election officials and election experts who genuinely want to run good elections. They want turnout to be high, and they want the public to have faith in the process. That makes this whole conversation way easier when it comes to policy recommendations, because I think we are dealing with, we are not dealing with ill intent. We are just dealing with differences in, problem-solving mechanisms, which is perfectly fine. Based on watching 2020 unfold, Civic Nebraska has, I think, 4 specific improvements that we've noticed that could be made in our system. And I want to quickly be transparent about the framework that we use to approach these conversations about policy. And that is that at Civic Nebraska, we acknowledge that there might be, in any aspect of public policy, there could be systems that are just fundamentally broken and need to be replaced. We don't ever start there. We always want to start with the question of, is our current system working as well as it can? And if not, what can we do to get it there? That's where we start. Now, we might get to a point where we say, this component is just broken. We've got to get rid of it. But in my 3 years of doing this so far, when it comes to elections, we haven't gotten there in terms of it's time for a wholesale change. That was, I think, became apparent in the May primary when I found myself kind of clashing with both state parties on their approach to how we adapt to COVID and vote by mail. I was critical of the state Republican Party and their kind of dismissal of the tool kind of wholesale. I was also critical of the Democratic Party and their calls to to kind of make us an all-mail state overnight, which I didn't think was the right thing to do. So that being said, these 4 policy suggestions come from that framework of what can we do to make our current system as great as possible. 4 things that I've noticed watching 2020 unfold that we could do. They're not in particular order, except for the first one. I do have one overwhelming #1 recommendation to make our vote by mail system better, and that is to improve our ballot tracking system. We have a website. You can view the status of your ballot. 2 major things that current website lacks. One, it does not proactively notify you. You have to know where the website is. You've got to remember to check it out, and you've got to hope that it's being updated. I guess those are both the things. It's not proactive, and you've got to know about it. So it's not a tool that is really actively promoted. There are a number of tools available. My current favorite is a tool called Ballot Scout. Ballot Scout is an app you can download on your phone, and the process is essentially you'll get notified every step of the way when your ballot moves across the city or across the state. So you will get an email and an alert on your phone or a text message when your ballot is sent to you, so you know to expect it. So when I try to steal Linda's ballot, she'll know it's supposed to be there, so it gets even harder to do. You will get an alert when they've received the ballot back from you. And most importantly, you'll get an alert when your ballot is officially counted. Or if your ballot was rejected, which is almost certainly because you forgot to sign the envelope, you will get a notification with instructions of how to get your vote counted. That's called a ballot curing process, when we say it was rejected, but it's almost always just a genuine mistake. Here's how we can fix it. I think this is the #1 thing we can do to improve the confidence and the efficiency of our vote by mail system. We need a proactive, more accessible ballot tracking system. And the tools are available. We just have to pull the trigger and make it happen in Nebraska. 3 other recommendations, and I haven't ranked these because they're all important, but the ballot tracking, again, is just if we can make one thing magically happen, I think that's the next thing to do. The second recommendation has to do with our giving equal access to all counties when it comes to the actual tool of vote by mail. Because while all voters have access to vote early without excuse, not every county has same access to the tool of vote by mail. I mentioned earlier that there are 11 counties who conduct elections using an all-mail system, which means they mail ballots to all registered voters, which can be returned in person, drop box, or by mail. If a county has more than 10,000 residents, they are not even allowed to really consider using that as a tool for one or all of their precincts. I've been working on this for about 2 years. I've been asking pretty often and pretty loudly why we make that arbitrary distinction, and I have yet to find a satisfactory answer. I understand historically why we're here, because in 2005, when we first allowed this to happen, voting by mail was not a thing most people did. And it was really an accommodation for some of the enormous counties Nebraska has, where we found that voters in, say, Cherry County were having to drive an hour to their nearest polling place. And the legislature said, that's not acceptable. Here's a fix for these counties specifically. Fast forward 15 years, and we all know that voting by mail is no longer unusual. It's very, very common. And we need to give all counties equal access to this tool. Again, I am not suggesting, nor do I think that the state would all of a sudden become an all-mail state. But I do think that just because one county has 10,000 residents and one has 15,000 residents, it doesn't make any sense to me that those county clerks or election commissioners shouldn't have same access to this tool, which, again, as we know, has proven to increase turnout. As a matter of fact, the league has been excellent in their support of some of those initiatives. And I remember a representative from the league who said, I think very articulately, that if you have a tool that is proven to increase turnout and you give it to some counties, but not all counties, you are inherently giving more weight to the votes of people in those counties, which I think is pretty hard to deny. So that's a problem only the legislature can fix. So we're continuing to push that. A third fix that I think could be really prudent is an online request form for our vote by mail ballots. I think it has been a great decision by the state and by the counties to mail out those request forms in light of COVID to every registered voter. But if that's not going to continue in future elections, we need to make it easier to request a vote by mail ballot. We have the technology, and I know that because we have online voter registration. And if we can do online voter registration, we can certainly do online ballot request forms. That combined with a better ballot tracking system would be incredibly safe and incredibly efficient. And last but not least, and I'll admit, this is one that took me longer than it should have to come around to, but this is the idea of paid postage for vote by mail ballots. I have had a number of friends kind of calling in disbelief as they're voting by mail for the first time and realize that it's not just a prepaid postage situation. Your request forms are prepaid, your ballots are not. Now, can most of us figure out how to get a stamp on the ballot and mail it back? Sure. But that's not how you set good policy based on, well, we're pretty sure most people can do this. I think the state has an obligation to do everything it can to provide a uniform, consistent experience for voters, regardless of their geography, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their economic status, regardless of whether or not they have stamps in their house. And I think that the COVID pandemic made this really undeniable when you had some folks who were quarantined, I mean, literally quarantined for health reasons, and then realized, oh my gosh, I don't have stamps. What's that person going to do? Just because that doesn't happen to the majority of voters doesn't mean it's not a very serious consideration. I also think going back to the notion of running the state like a business, this is a pretty fundamental customer service issue, I think, for me. This is strangely my background before elections was working in the service industry. And this is one of those issues where it's just pretty glaring that this would improve the convenience and the overall attitude towards the process. Will it be expensive? Yes, it will be expensive. That's why I was hesitant, but I think it's a conversation that we really need to have. As someone who works for a nonpartisan organization, I always want to end with this kind of positive note, which is that I am also thrilled to report genuinely that there is no evidence anywhere in the country that vote by mail has an inherent partisan advantage in either direction. Voting by mail is a tool that does increase turnout and it does increase efficiency, but it benefits whichever party promotes vote by mail, and that's been proven across the country. It increases turnout, it increases efficiency, it provides a better voting experience. As I just mentioned, there are improvements that can be made, certainly. But in general, I'm extremely proud to get to work on elections and voting rights in Nebraska. Again, because we've got election officials who care so much about their jobs and are so good at their jobs. We've got partners like the league who do put in so much work to make elections accessible to everyone and to keep them safe. And I think that because of COVID, but also just because of the momentum of the country in general, I think that voting by mail is going to continue to expand and continue to be relevant. And so I'm really glad we're having this conversation so that we can continue to improve the system and keep our elections safe and fair. So thank you all so much for having me. That's my pitch. And I would be thrilled to keep chatting or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Weston. You hit everything so perfectly. Working at the office, I get all of the questions with everyone just receiving their ballots. They're wondering, who do I vote for? How do I answer this, etc. And so you answered like all of our major concerns that the league has been being asked. Sorry, my dog Pancake is being loud. But yeah, so does anyone have any questions for Weston? Do we need any clarification on any of the terms he perhaps used?
This is Linda. I had, when you first started talking about it, I made a note of where you mentioned that 11 counties fully use vote by mail or vote at home. I kind of like that. Glad to hear that. And then 7 counties partially. And so I want a little more information about that. And how do those, how do they, the people in those counties feel about their neighbors being mailed ballots, but they have to go to a little more trouble to vote? Any thought, any Any feedback on that from any of those voters?
That's a great question. I think that's feedback that's going to start pouring in after the general election. I think in the primary, it was just so new to everyone, especially with everyone being mailed. Yeah, with everyone being mailed the vote by mail request forms, the impact was, I think, mitigated a little bit this election. But in general, that's a really excellent point. So when those counties, again, still have to be smaller than 10,000 people, when they submit their applications to the Secretary of State to say, hey, we want to have all mail elections, it can be for any number of reasons. And before 2018, it was never for a whole county. It was really based on, like, could have been about geography. There are a couple precincts that were approved because that precinct just didn't have any available ADA compliant buildings to be polling places. So there's a number of reasons why the tool's kind of evolved. But now that we're doing countywide, it's pretty clear that we like this as a tool just because it's a useful tool. It increases turnout, it makes it easier. So yeah, I think it is those counties that have some precincts, but not all, that are voting by mail, kind of highlight the problem for the rest of us, like in Douglas County. It just shows how strange it is that we would give some folks access to this increased level of convenience, but not others. So no, we have not had a lot of complaints about that yet, because again, the county and the state have really stepped up to mail out those request forms. But I think as this continues, that will become a very, very relevant part of the conversation.
Weston, so do I understand that if there's a county with under 10,000 people, they do not have the right to vote by mail? They have to go to a precinct to vote. Is that correct?
Good question. Thanks for asking. So it's not
And
quite right. And it does get very confusing. So every voter in Nebraska, no matter where you live, you can vote by mail and you can vote early. Doesn't matter if you're in Scottsbluff or Garden County or Douglas County. The 10,000 rule is about counties who want to run elections entirely by mail. So if a county says, we just want to skip the request process, we want to mail every registered voter a ballot, and that's just going to be our new system. Counties with more than 10,000 people are not allowed to do that. So the voters themselves can do it.
But the voters themselves, if they're registered, they can request a ballot for at home.
Yep.
Right.
And that question right there is I think is some of the opposition we get to kind of attacking this population cap in the first place. People's like, we have no excuse for early voting. People can do it. Who cares? The problem is, and this is irrefutable after watching the May primary, is that having permission is great, but there is simply no substitute for creating a standard that is promoted by the state or by the county. Those two components objectively increase turnout. And those are components that only happen if the entire county says, listen, this is our new system. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to put all of our resources into this one way of doing things, and we're going to make it better. It's a method that's just proven to increase turnout. So I am thrilled that we are a no excuse early voting state, but there are gains to be made in both turnout and efficiency that could really only be made by making it more of a system than a kind of a scattershot choice. But great question, Marlene. Thanks for asking.
And my other comment was, when I used to be at the office, frequent questions, that phone used to ring off the hook asking about all these judges that are on the ballot that people know absolutely nothing about, and for the most part leave empty, or they guess and just vote for all of them. And I know that very few people know that they can call the Nebraska Bar Association, and every 2 years they do an evaluation of the judges. And that report is accessible to voters in this state. And this year, when I looked at that, there were several judges on there that I was a little surprised at their ratings, and they were up for re-election. So I wondered if there's how people can get that information, because it's not common knowledge to know they can do that.
Hey, can I interrupt? This is Mary Lee Moulton from the League of Women Voters. That rating it's on both our state and our Greater Omaha website. Links to that. So
Oh.
we posted the Bar Association report.
Oh, that's a good thing to do, Mary Lee. I didn't know that. Great.
Yeah, it's on the websites, both of them.
I'll also
Sorry,
add it in
didn't
the
mean to
chat here.
interrupt, Weston.
Great.
It's also in the chat for everyone.
Yep, that was my answer. Is that I use you all as the resource for that. So that's, you guys are all over it.
Ken, did I see somewhere, I forget now, you know, there's been so much information flying at us from all directions, but I want to say that you had not only the Nebraska Bar Association website listed somewhere, but one or two other sources, or am I confusing that with sources for, because another question I know you're getting is about initiatives and amendments.
Right. We have.
Right. No, you're not incorrect. Candace, let me interrupt. We actually put Ballotpedia on there, and we also had the Nebraska Secretary of State site, but you're right, it's for the initiatives that we have those on there.
Right,
for.
okay, got it. I'd like to tell everybody something that I learned last week that I think is really quite fascinating. For a while there, it's about Lancaster County. For a while there, we had been hearing that there would only be the one drop box in Lancaster County. And I thought that was pretty awful. I mean, we were just like, that is not service. So what they actually did is there are more, instead of drop boxes, they're ballot boxes. So they're the, the large metal boxes that you actually have in a polling place when you go to vote in person. And they have those in various libraries. I forget how many, and I think they're all libraries. I'm pretty sure. I know there's one in Waverly, and so they're actually inside the libraries, and people can go and drop off their ballots in those metal boxes. And of course, it has to be when the library is open. That's the only time you could do that. But after knowing that there are people who are concerned about going to outside drop boxes, especially, if there's like nobody else around, or I don't know what I want to say here, but anyway, I think that's just really interesting that there'll be at least there would be somebody there when you're depositing it, and there would be no like intimidation or anything like that. So I just think that's, and I think it's a very inexpensive way for them to have solved that problem. So I just want to kind of give a shout out to Lancaster County for that idea.
And FYI, that's also on our state website, the list of where all of those locations are for Lancaster County.
Good, great.
Yeah, I think the value of drop boxes and vote by mail systems cannot be overstated. I think that a huge barrier to adoption at first is just this perception that, as a culture, we think voting is, we take our ballot, we put it in the ballot box, and then it counts. There's obviously a lot more to it than that, but that's just, when we think of voting, that's the image we think of. So one of the biggest barriers to expanding vote by mail is the perception that, well, that's just not how it works. And so I think the role of drop boxes is really important. One, because it's convenient, but two, it feels at least similar. Like, okay, here's this secure structure, my ballot goes in, it's counted. And I always try to be very, I could think about this all day, so it's no longer a weird idea to me, but like it's totally understandable that process, the vote by mail process, feels less understandable or feels foreign compared to voting in person. But I do think that drop boxes are huge in alleviating that. And I actually, as another positive update from the last legislative session, is that starting next year, so we worked with Senator Tom Brewer to pass legislation that will, and this is more of a safeguard for the future, because every county was already doing this really well, but any county that becomes an all-mail county in the future absolutely has to have at least one secure drop box in their county and at least one in-person voting option, which will be the clerk or commissioner's office. Certainly room to expand if they need to, and I'm thrilled that Lancaster County has, but we will never in Nebraska have elections that don't have some kind of drop box or in-person option. That's important for a lot of reasons.
Could I talk about the ballot curing process a little bit more? So
Yeah.
I know that it's kind of varies quite a bit with the various counties. I know that this, I think I'm correct in this, and that if you, for instance, if your ballot, you've forgotten to sign the envelope that your ballot comes in, and Douglas County, they send you a letter. And then but then in, I believe it's Sarpy County, either Sarpy or Lancaster, they don't do anything. It's just, they assume you can find that ballot tracking, the voter check on a website and figure it out that way. And then I know that, well, another thing I want to ask is, do all the, I don't believe, and I hope I'm wrong, that all of the counties get the information up right away to put on the website, the ballot tracking website. So if you drop off your ballot on, in a Dropbox, that by 24 hours later, it's on the Secretary of State website or wherever.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Linda. So I'll go in reverse order. So my understanding is that all counties are pretty equally efficient in how fast they get the data up. I can't personally vouch for how that works, but I haven't heard from any. I mean, we get a lot of phone calls. Our voting rights team does about various concerns or complaints about the system, and I don't think we get a lot about massive delays in the process. Certainly when there's spikes in volume. Like I remember tracking my own ballot last year, and it took, I think, like 48 hours for it to get totally accurate on the website. But yeah, so you brought up something really important with the ballot curing, which is that, again, we're in a great spot because we have excellent election officials in our state, but it is important to know that there is no law that requires any county to proactively notify people who have their ballot rejected. It's really just kind of based on the capacity and the willingness of the election official in every county. As a rule, I don't think that's a great way of doing things, because if there's an obvious best practice, we should probably just make sure everyone's doing it. That's another reason why I love a tool like Ballot Scout and a more tech savvy ballot tracking system, is because it takes the work out of it too for the election officials. But
Weston, speaking of Ballot Scout, that requires the voter to give their mobile number?
That's a great question. There would have to be a number in order to get those alerts. You would create a secure account on the Ballot Scout system, just like you'd create a login for your banking app or whatever. You'd have a secure login that's only yours, and they would notify you. This is a tool that, as you can tell, I'm extremely excited to learn more about. I'm hoping to get my hands on some demos soon, because I think the technology is just really useful and really.
Okay, so it would be obviously an opt-in kind of thing, and there would be plenty of people.
Oh yeah, definitely an opt-in. If you're not comfortable or you don't have a smartphone or whatever, that's totally fine. But that system would be managed in a way that it would be so much more efficient to notify voters. Because right now, in Douglas County, they rely largely on organizations like Civic Nebraska and the League to, I would call them ballot chase phone calls to say like, hey, did you know that your ballot was rejected? It's a fine stopgap, but also can be confusing, because as national rhetoric becomes nastier and nastier in terms of election fraud or nefarious actors. We had some very well-meaning volunteers who called some voters last May to say, hey, did you know your ballot was rejected? And the response was like, is this a scam? What are you trying to do? Those kind of systems are becoming, I think, less and less sustainable. So to have something that is more official and frankly just more efficient, I think is pretty necessary at this point.
I have another question. Excuse me. I had another question. What's happening like in our state when the election commission receives the ballots? Are they opened ahead of time? Do they put them on a pile and run them through the machines at the very end, or are they tabulating them along the way, or what's happening? What happens when our ballots, when they get them?
Linda's excited to answer this question.
Oh, am I? I just learned that today and this is Douglas County. Well, yeah, Douglas and Sarpy. I was on a call with both commissioners, and they each do a little bit differently, but in Sarpy County, they receive the ballots. They are all, you know what, this, I don't remember the part, and you probably know, Weston, they check the signatures. I think as soon as they come in, that means accepted. That's where you get the accepted thing. And then what I'm not sure about is do they get opened? I don't know if they get opened now. I mean, as of, or do they wait? Yeah. And then they have all these stacks of ballots, and then they can start the day before counting the ballots. And so she said they are going to start on Monday, that's November 2nd. So they're going to start counting those those early ballots. She said if they feel like they need to start at 12:01 a.m. on Monday the 2nd, they're going to do that. Brian Cruz said they will start, I forget now if it's 5, maybe, you know, darn it. Here I say I can answer the question. And I don't know if it's at 5 p.m. on Monday or if it's that they'll start counting. I think it is. I think he said they're going to start at 5 p.m. on Monday, counting the early ballots. Yeah. I know they're working a lot of overtime, a lot of, you know, weekends, nights.
So they'll count all night then.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be all night, but yeah.
No,
And then I think, yeah, does that sound about right, Weston?
Yeah, that's great. So I don't remember the timelines off the top of my head. They're pretty easy to find in statute, but yes, when the ballot is received, the signature is verified, and once it's verified, there's a much larger window where it can be opened and sorted, but nothing is counted any earlier than 24 hours before the opening of the polls. So, and some states don't have that, which is why you hear about, you know, election results not coming 7 or 8 days after the election, which, again, my shameless plug every time I say this, which is that it is more important to have accurate results than results on November 3rd. But in Nebraska, I'm pretty confident we're going to have some pretty fast results. Now, of course, Douglas County is huge. Douglas County is being talked about a lot in terms of the role it might play in the presidential election. So that will slow everything down, understandably. But most county clerks and commissioners are feeling really good that they'll have preliminary results on election night. And that's due in large part to the fact
they're stored in a safe place too when they get them. They have to be stored in a very, very safe place. If there's a fire or something happens, that those ballots are protected.
Yep, you got it. They are only moved when they absolutely have to be, and they are kept very, very safe.
So is there just a certain amount of people that are eligible to handle those, or just does anybody do this?
In terms of counting?
Yes, and handling those ballots. So some of them aren't, like they said, found in a wastebasket someplace, or, you know, we hear all this crazy stuff about where they find ballots around this country, which I think is frightening to a lot of people. But that's what I wondered about ballot security.
Yeah, I mean, in order to handle those ballots, you've got to be a verified employee of the commissioner's office. The ballots are kept under constant surveillance. The work is constantly being verified by, there's a pretty robust chain of supervision that happens, but especially when it comes to the counting process. But even for sorting, if there is any sort of discrepancy in signature matching, or who's this person trying to vote for, or does this vote count, there is never a single individual who gets to make that call. There's a very robust chain of command, and it's documented, and most importantly, it is, I don't know the correct way to say this word, auditable, I guess would be how you say that. I didn't have time to get into audits today, but that's a whole other component of election policy that is, I think, under talked about, but very important. And that is that no first draft of election results are ever called official. They are all audited. They are all canvassed. They are all certified. They would make any college professor proud in terms of their academic rigor. There are many drafts, many checks. But no, it's a great question. And I think that what I find frustrating is that a lot of those stories we hear about, oh, so-and-so threw these ballots away or whatever, either number one, there unfortunately those are stories that are just kind of thrown out into the world a lot of times without actual evidence. But
Right.
two, I mean, I mentioned the North Carolina example. I mean, that happened, but again, that was a campaign before the ballots even got to the commissioner's office. It is extremely rare for an employee of a county clerk or county commissioner's office to do something like that. And if they do, they will certainly be caught, and it will not be very fun for them. So that in Nebraska, as I guess is all I can speak to. In Nebraska, we've got a very robust system in place to make sure that no single individual even really has the chance to do something like that.
Yeah, and I think that is really, as a citizen of this state, that really makes me feel confident. But you know, I worry about those people like we hear down in Texas, there was only going to be one drop box in a county. We hear about, and I saw on television last night, those poor people that stood in line for 8-10 hours to vote in Georgia with early voting starting. You know, it just made sense to me. I know there's a thing called states' rights, but you would think with the constitutional right for every citizen in this United States that we have the right to vote, that there would be some kind of continuity between states that would ensure that I could vote by mail or go to my voting site and not have to stand in line for 8 to 10 hours. That's unheard of in this state. If you're there for an hour, it's unheard of in this state. And so I just wish there was better continuity and we wouldn't have to hear about poor people around this country that are going through hell to have to vote.
No, I agree with you. What's happening in you brought up I think the two examples I lose the most sleep over. The situation in Texas and Georgia is just, it's just outrageous. And again, it's always hard to confidently place malicious intent on people, but some of the decisions they make are at best just extremely ignorant of how things actually work.
Right. And do we have any militias that are going to be, that we've heard of, that are going to be at voter locations around our state, monitoring and intimidating people? Have we heard about that in our state?
We have not heard anything about Nebraska specifically. I mean, we're certainly, you know, as you all probably know, Civic Nebraska has a pretty robust election observation program. I know that many league members participate, which we really appreciate. But that is something we're going to be extra aware of this year. You know, there have been calls from some national politicians to engage in behavior that's just really unacceptable for poll workers. And that's I was very proud to work with Senator Matt Hansen and the Nebraska Association of County Officials and several of our election commissioners this year to kind of create a couple basic standards into law to say, here's what a poll worker can and can't do. And those laws were created, one, to protect our program, but two, to make sure that nobody gets to cross the line, because like any tool, I mean, election observation is a tool that can be really beneficial or it can be misused. So in Nebraska, no, we have not heard of any like active, you know, threats or groups that are really going to try to cause a stink, but we will definitely, our observers will be out in force and that's part of what we'll be watching for, is make sure everyone
That's good to know.
minds the rules.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there any other questions from anyone? Let's see. I do have something I'd like to ask, or we can just talk briefly about it. My husband's in the military, and so I was asking him like what he plans on doing, because he's not from here, but he's stationed here in Offutt, and so he isn't necessarily in tune with everything going on and doesn't really like politics. And so I was really just taking control of the situation. I was like, okay, you should vote here because you live here. But I then was like, okay, so you're one person in this kind of like situation. And with the league right now, we're dealing with a lot of how do we reach communities that we don't necessarily get to participate with or get to talk to. And so I was thinking, like, what do we do in terms of those that are, you know, in service or in the military, how do we make sure that they're also voting or, participating civically? And I was just wondering if your organization has ever interacted with their kind of essence, or, how do you see that panning out? I don't know.
No, that's great. That's a great question. I think that's a great example, I think, of the importance that active promotion by more official bodies can play in expanding vote by mail. Because, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up for a couple of reasons. One, because in the vote by mail conversation, I mean, service members is why we have vote by mail in the first place. I mean, there's been by mail voting since this country was founded, and it was originally to make sure that, somebody from Boston who was deployed in, I don't know, Virginia could still vote, and they would just vote. They put it in the mail and it was counted as normal. We have a pretty robust system from a policy side to account for, the fact that you're no longer deployed in Virginia. You can be deployed in a different continent. It's called we call it UOCAVA. It's the Uniformed Overseas. I don't remember the rest of the letters, but it's a law that was written specifically to make sure that overseas deployed service members could participate effectively in their democracy. On a policy side, we make extra accommodations in terms of electronic voting for service members specifically. So, and I won't pretend to know all of them off the top of my head, but they have access to do certain things like via email, for example, that we don't accept for most voters. So I'll definitely look up. I'll find some resources and send them along. But on a policy side, we try to make that easier. But yeah, from more of like a cultural side, it's I think I don't have any idea what the military does in terms of promoting, civic participation by. I shouldn't say civic participation; they're obviously participating, but
Right.
voting
Not to be
by,
disrespectful or anything, but right.
yeah, voting by service members. But I think that could have a huge impact.
I'm learning a little bit more about it. So if I learn more, I'll let you know, and we'll see if there's a possible collaboration there of how we can get those service members, in gear to vote. I know a lot of them aren't even thinking about it because I know my husband's friends in their group. But I'm glad we talked about it because that is a community that we don't necessarily think of as part of our communities. When we think of state, initiatives, we don't really talk about those who are in service that are, accidentally citizens as well and should have a voice as well. But
Absolutely.
is there anything else anyone would want to talk about? We're close to wrapping up here.
Thank
like
you. This was very informative.
Thank
My
you so much
Thank you
for
for being here.
joining. We enjoyed your questions and our dialogue. But if anyone wants to ask Weston another question, please feel free to email me and I can send a connection email, or we can figure out how to relay your questions to Weston. Thank you so much, Weston, for being here and talking to us. I have so much great content that I'm going to share with everyone on our Instagram page. So if you'd like to see a highlight of what we talked about here, please feel free to check out our social media as well as our YouTube where this will be posted. Alrighty, well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.